The old music academy stood near the center of the city, surrounded by tall buildings, busy streets, and glowing signs that never seemed to turn off. During the day, expensive cars lined the front entrance while talented students walked through the glass doors carrying violins, guitars, and thick music books. Most people believed only rich and gifted young musicians could survive inside that building. But every evening, after the students finished their classes and the teachers slowly disappeared into the cold city night, another man quietly entered through the side door carrying a mop bucket and cleaning supplies. His name was Daniel Reed. Most students barely noticed him. To them, he was simply the janitor who cleaned the hallways, emptied trash cans, and polished the floors after everyone went home. He always wore the same dark jacket, old shoes, and a tired expression that made him look older than he really was. Daniel rarely spoke unless someone spoke to him first. Every night, he moved silently through the academy while music drifted through the walls. Sometimes soft piano melodies floated from one room while loud violin practice came from another. Daniel listened carefully as he worked. Even while wiping tables or cleaning dusty corners, his attention always stayed on the music. There was something different about the way he listened. Not casually, not like background noise. He listened as if every note meant something personal. One rainy evening, students rushed through the hall preparing for an important announcement. Excited voices echoed everywhere. They say a famous director is coming next week. The winner might get invited to perform overseas. This could change someone's entire career. Daniel quietly stepped aside as groups of students hurried past him without even making eye contact. A few accidentally bumped his cleaning cart but never apologized. Near the piano hall, a tall student wearing an expensive coat laughed loudly while talking to his friends. "Whoever gets chosen is basically set for life," he said proudly. "I've been preparing for this for months." His friends nodded immediately. "That director only picks the best." "Yeah, nobody ordinary stands a chance." Daniel kept mopping the floor silently while listening to their conversation. Inside the main theater, the academy director stood on stage before hundreds of students. He was an older man with calm eyes and a serious voice that demanded attention the moment he spoke. "As many of you already know," he announced, "a world-renowned music director will visit this academy in 7 days. One pianist will be selected for a special international performance." Excitement exploded through the room. Some students smiled confidently while others looked nervous. "This opportunity could open doors you have dreamed about for years," the director continued. "So give these next 7 days everything you have." The crowd burst into applause. From the back hallway, Daniel quietly listened while holding a broom in his hand. For a brief moment, something painful crossed his face. A memory, a dream he once carried long ago. But he quickly pushed the feeling away and returned to work. Late that night, the academy became almost empty. Rain tapped softly against the windows while dim lights reflected across the polished floors. Daniel cleaned the final hallway before slowly approaching the large piano room at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly open. Inside sat the academy's grand piano. The room was silent. Daniel glanced around carefully to make sure nobody was nearby. Then he quietly stepped inside. For a few seconds, he simply stared at the piano. The black polished surface reflected the soft ceiling lights. It looked untouched, almost sacred. Daniel slowly walked closer, his footsteps barely making a sound. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached toward the keys. Then he stopped. He looked down at his rough hands. Hands shaped by years of hard work. Hands that once moved across piano keys every single day. A deep breath escaped his chest. Finally, he sat down carefully on the piano bench. The moment his fingers touched the keys, his entire expression changed. The tired janitor disappeared. Something hidden awakened inside him. At first, he played very softly. Slow notes filled the empty room like quiet whispers. The melody carried sadness, warmth, and memories too heavy for words. Each note felt alive. Daniel closed his eyes as the music carried him somewhere far away from the academy halls. For the first time in years, he looked peaceful. But he didn't know someone was standing outside the room. The tall student from earlier had returned after forgetting his phone in the theater. As he passed the piano hall, he suddenly froze after hearing the music. His eyes widened. Then his expression slowly changed into confusion. He pushed the door open harder. The music stopped immediately. Daniel quickly stood up from the bench. The student stared at him in disbelief. "You?" he said with a laugh. "You were playing?" Daniel lowered his eyes slightly. "I was just testing the keys." Within seconds, two other students appeared behind the tall student after hearing the noise. "What's going on?" Then one of them noticed Daniel standing beside the piano. "No way," another student laughed. "The janitor thinks he's a pianist now?" The tall student crossed his arms with a smirk. "Go on," he mocked. "Play something for us." Daniel stepped back from the piano quietly. "I should get back to work." But the students continued laughing. "This is actually funny. Maybe he thinks the director will pick him next week." Imagine paying academy fees just to lose against the cleaning guy. Their laughter filled the room. Daniel picked up his cleaning cloth and walked toward the door without saying anything. He had learned long ago that silence hurt less than arguing. But just before he reached the hallway, a calm voice suddenly spoke behind them. "That was beautiful." Everyone turned immediately. The academy director stood near the entrance. Nobody had noticed him arrive. The students instantly became nervous. The director slowly looked toward Daniel. "How long have you been playing?" he asked quietly. Daniel looked uncomfortable. "Not for many years." The room fell silent. Even the students stopped smiling. The director stepped closer to the piano. "The way you touched those keys," he said softly. "That is not beginner talent." Daniel remained quiet. The tall student quickly interrupted. "Sir, he was probably just copying something simple." But the director ignored him completely. Instead, he kept his attention on Daniel. "Would you sit down and play again?" Daniel's face tightened immediately. "No, sir." "Why not?" Daniel hesitated for several seconds before answering. "Some things belong in the past." Without waiting for another question, he quietly left the room carrying his cleaning supplies. The students exchanged confused looks while the director continued staring at the piano thoughtfully. That night, long after everyone went home, Daniel sat alone inside his tiny apartment on the edge of the city. The room was small and cold. A single lamp glowed near the window while rain continued falling outside. He removed his old jacket slowly and sat on the edge of the bed in silence. Then his eyes drifted toward a dusty wooden box hidden beneath a table. For a long moment he simply stared at it. Finally, he reached down and pulled it closer. The box creaked softly as he opened it. Inside were old music sheets, faded photographs, and several small medals covered in dust. Daniel carefully picked up one photo. A younger version of himself smiled beside a piano many years earlier. Standing proudly next to him was an older man with kind eyes and a warm smile. Daniel's father. His hands tightened slightly around the photograph. "You always believed I could do something special," he whispered quietly. His voice almost broke. Outside, thunder rumbled across the dark sky. Daniel leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. But the music from earlier still echoed inside his mind. And for the first time in many years, the dream he buried deep inside himself no longer felt completely dead. The next morning, the academy buzzed with gossip before classes had even started. Students stood in small groups near the lockers, whispering and laughing while checking their phones. "Did you hear about the janitor? The one who touched the grand piano? I heard the director actually asked him to play." Some students laughed harder every time the story spread. Others seemed curious, but nobody took it seriously. To most of them, Daniel Reed was still just the quiet man who cleaned their classrooms every night. As Daniel entered through the side hallway carrying fresh cleaning supplies, conversations suddenly became quieter around him. A few students stared openly while others smirked behind his back. He pretended not to notice. He had spent most of his life learning how to ignore people. Still, something felt different now. Before, students barely saw him. Now, they looked at him like he was entertainment. Daniel kept his eyes lowered and continued toward the practice halls. The smell of floor polish mixed with fresh coffee drifting from the teacher's lounge nearby. Music floated through the building from every direction as students prepared for the upcoming selection performance. Inside one piano room, a young woman practiced difficult scales repeatedly while her instructor corrected every small mistake. In another room, two students argued about performance order. The pressure inside the academy was growing stronger every hour. Everyone wanted the director's attention. Everyone wanted success. And somehow, Daniel had accidentally become part of their conversations. As he cleaned the second-floor hallway, the tall student from the previous night suddenly appeared with two friends beside him. "Well, look who's here," he said loudly. Daniel continued wiping the windows without responding. One of the other students chuckled. "You should perform for us again." "Yeah," another added. "Maybe the academy should replace all of us with janitors." They laughed. Daniel stayed calm. "I'm just here to work," he answered quietly. But the tall student stepped closer. "You know what's funny?" he said. "For a second last night, I actually thought you knew what you were doing." His friends laughed again. Daniel finally looked at him directly. "There's nothing wrong with loving music," he said calmly. The student's smile faded slightly, almost annoyed by how peaceful Daniel sounded. Before he could answer, a voice interrupted from the end of the hallway. "That's enough." The academy director walked toward them with a serious expression. The students immediately straightened themselves. "You have rehearsal in 10 minutes, the director said firmly. "Unless mocking employees has become part of your training." The students quickly apologized and walked away without another word. The director waited until they disappeared before turning toward Daniel. "You handled that better than most people would," he said. Daniel gave a small shrug. "Young people speak without thinking sometimes." The director studied him carefully. "You still haven't answered my question from last night." Daniel continued cleaning silently. "Where did you learn to play like that?" For several seconds, only the sound of distant piano practice filled the hallway. Finally, Daniel spoke quietly. "My father taught me when I was young." The director listened closely. "He believed music could change a person's life," Daniel continued. "He worked long hours, but every evening he still found time to teach me." And then, Daniel's hand slowed against the glass window. Life changed. His voice carried no anger, only tiredness. The director sensed there was far more to the story, but he didn't push further. Instead, he asked something unexpected. "Would you consider auditioning?" Daniel looked up immediately. "No, you didn't even think about it." "I already know the answer." The director folded his arms. "Talent like yours doesn't disappear." Daniel smiled faintly, though sadness rested behind it. "Maybe not, but opportunities do." Before the director could reply, Daniel politely excused himself and moved toward another hallway. The director watched him leave, growing more curious with every conversation. That evening, after classes ended, the academy slowly became quieter. Students headed home while a few stayed behind for extra practice. Daniel worked alone in the theater, carefully wiping the armrests and sweeping beneath the seats. The large room felt peaceful when empty, but his mind wasn't peaceful at all. The director's words kept returning. "Would you consider auditioning?" Daniel stopped sweeping for a moment and looked toward the stage. The grand piano sat under a soft spotlight. Waiting, he quickly looked away. "No," he whispered to himself. "That part of life is over." But deep inside, he wasn't fully convincing himself anymore. Later that night, Daniel returned home carrying a small paper bag with bread and soup for dinner. His apartment building was old, with cracked walls and flickering hallway lights. Most people hurried through without greeting each other. Inside his apartment, silence welcomed him. He placed the food on the kitchen counter and loosened his tired shoulders. Near the window stood an old keyboard piano covered by a cloth. Daniel stared at it for a long moment. Slowly, he walked closer and pulled the cloth away. Dust covered several keys. He sat down carefully. For years, he avoided touching this piano unless memories became too heavy to ignore. But tonight felt different. His fingers rested above the keys. Then suddenly, a memory returned so clearly it almost felt real. A younger Daniel sat beside his father in a tiny living room many years earlier. Sunlight entered through thin curtains while old music sheets covered the table. Again, his father said warmly. But this time, don't just play the notes. Feel them. Young Daniel tried again, concentrating carefully. His father smiled proudly. There it is, he said softly. Music tells the truth about what's inside a person. The memory faded. Daniel blinked slowly and looked down at his hands resting on the keyboard. His eyes became distant. Another memory surfaced. This one darker. A hospital hallway. Doctors speaking quietly. Bills stacking higher every month. Then the funeral. After his father passed away, everything collapsed quickly. Daniel had been accepted into a respected music program back then. Teachers believed he had real talent. Some even predicted a professional future for him. But dreams became impossible when survival came first. His younger sister still needed food, school supplies, and rent money. So Daniel left music behind and began taking every job he could find. Construction work, warehouse shifts, night cleaning, anything that paid enough. At first, he promised himself it would only be temporary. But temporary slowly turned into years. Then even longer. Eventually, music became nothing more than a painful reminder of the life he almost had. Daniel exhaled slowly and closed the keyboard cover. I did what I had to do, he whispered quietly. But even after saying it aloud, his chest still felt heavy. The next day, the academy director sat alone in his office reviewing old academy files and performance records. Daniel's story continued bothering him. There was something unusual about the way he played. Not flashy, not showy, real, experienced. The director opened an online archive connected to old regional music competitions. After several searches, he suddenly froze. A photograph appeared on the screen. A teenage boy standing beside a piano while holding a first-place trophy. The name beneath the photo read, Daniel Reed. The director leaned closer in surprise. He opened another article. Then another. Each one mentioned Daniel as a rising young pianist years ago. Extraordinary emotional control. A natural performer. One of the most promising young musicians in the region. The director sat back slowly. How did someone like that disappear? He murmured. At that exact moment, Daniel cleaned nearby practice rooms completely unaware that pieces of his forgotten past were finally being uncovered. Later that afternoon, rehearsal pressure inside the academy became even more intense. Students argued over mistakes, teachers pushed harder, and everyone seemed exhausted. The tall student practiced aggressively in one room, clearly determined to impress the visiting director next week. But his focus kept breaking. Every time he played, Daniel's quiet melody from the piano hall returned to his mind. It irritated him deeply. How could a janitor play like that? He muttered. Meanwhile, Daniel quietly replaced trash bags outside the rehearsal rooms. As he passed one open doorway, he heard a student struggling through an emotional piano section repeatedly. The same mistake happened over and over. Daniel paused briefly. Without entering the room, he spoke softly. You're rushing the left hand. The student stopped playing immediately and looked confused. What? Daniel pointed gently toward the keys. You're trying to force the emotion too early, he explained. Let the silence breathe first. The student stared at him uncertainly but tried again. This time, the melody sounded smoother, more natural. The student's eyes widened slightly. Daniel realized what he had done and immediately continued walking before further questions followed. But inside the practice room, the student remained frozen in confusion. Because somehow, the janitor was right. By the middle of the week, the atmosphere inside the academy had completely changed. Students barely talked about regular classes anymore. Every hallway conversation centered around the same thing. The famous music director arriving in only 3 days. Some students practiced until their fingers hurt. Others stayed overnight inside rehearsal rooms trying to perfect every note. Pressure filled the building like heavy smoke. But along with the competition rumors, Another topic continued spreading through the academy. The janitor who could play piano. Daniel Reed tried his best to avoid attention, but it was becoming impossible. Students whispered when he passed by. Some laughed. Some stared curiously. A few even stopped speaking entirely whenever he entered a room. Daniel hated it. For years, he had survived by remaining invisible. Now everyone suddenly noticed him. That morning, he cleaned the main staircase while groups of students hurried past carrying music folders and coffee cups. Near the top floor, two young pianists spoke quietly near the railing. "Do you think the rumors are true?" "I don't know. But one teacher said the director has been asking questions about him." "That's crazy." Daniel kept his eyes lowered and continued sweeping. Inside, however, his thoughts felt restless. The academy director's questions kept replaying in his mind. "Why did you stop playing? Would you audition? Talent like yours doesn't disappear." Daniel tried to ignore those words, but they stayed with him no matter how hard he pushed them away. Later that afternoon, the academy held final rehearsal evaluations before the big event. Teachers sat inside the theater making notes while selected students performed short pieces one after another. Daniel quietly cleaned backstage storage rooms while music echoed through the walls. Suddenly, loud voices interrupted the rehearsal. "I can't play like this." Someone stormed out of the theater angrily. A young pianist rushed down the hallway holding his wrist in pain while another teacher followed behind him. "Stop moving your hand," the teacher warned. "You'll make it worse." The student looked frustrated and upset. "This can't be happening now." Daniel paused his cleaning as they passed. A few minutes later, whispers spread quickly through the building. One of the academy's top performers had injured his wrist and could no longer compete in the final performance lineup. The news shocked everyone. Students gathered in hallways discussing who might replace him. "This changes everything. They need another pianist immediately. I heard the director is furious." Inside the director's office, tension filled the air. Several teachers debated possible replacements while reviewing student files. None of the options impressed the director. Every candidate sounded technically strong, but something still felt missing. Then his eyes drifted toward the old competition articles sitting on his desk. Daniel Reed, the forgotten pianist. The director slowly leaned back in his chair. An idea formed in his mind. Risky, unexpected, but somehow it felt right. That evening, students gathered inside the theater for an important announcement regarding the updated performance lineup. Nervous whispers echoed across the room while teachers stood quietly near the stage. Daniel happened to be cleaning near the back entrance when the director stepped onto the stage. "As many of you know," the director began calmly, "we unfortunately lost one performer due to injury." The audience became silent. After careful consideration, a replacement has been selected. Several students straightened confidently in their seats, hoping their name would be called. Then the director spoke again. "The final piano position will go to Daniel Reed." For 1 second, nobody reacted. The room fell completely silent. Then confusion exploded everywhere. "What? The janitor? You can't be serious." Students turned toward the back entrance where Daniel stood frozen beside his cleaning cart. His face lost color immediately. The tall student who had mocked him earlier shot up from his chair. "This is ridiculous," he protested loudly. "There are students here who trained their whole lives for this." The director remained calm. "And some people spend their whole lives hiding talent," he answered firmly. The theater buzzed with tension. Daniel slowly stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable under everyone's attention. "Sir," he said quietly, "there must be some misunderstanding." "There isn't. I can't do this." The director looked directly at him. "You can." Daniel shook his head immediately. "No, I'm not part of this academy." "You work here every single day," the director replied. "You understand music better than many people in this room." Several students looked offended by that statement. The tall student crossed his arms angrily. "So now cleaning floors qualifies someone for the stage?" The director's expression hardened. "No," he said firmly, "but passion does." The room became silent again. Daniel could feel hundreds of eyes staring at him. His chest tightened. Every old fear returned at once. Fear of failure. Fear of humiliation. Fear of reopening a dream he buried years ago. "I appreciate the offer," Daniel said carefully, "but I can't accept." Without waiting for another response, he quietly walked out of the theater. Students immediately began arguing again the moment he left. "This is insane. He'll embarrass the academy. The director's making a mistake." But the director simply watched the doorway where Daniel disappeared. Something told him this story wasn't over yet. Outside, cold evening air hit Daniel's face as he stepped onto the empty sidewalk. Cars passed under glowing city lights while distant rain clouds gathered overhead. He walked for several blocks without knowing exactly where he was going. His thoughts felt chaotic. Why would the director do this? Why now? Why reopen something that took years to forget? By the time he reached home, night had fully arrived. Daniel unlocked his apartment door slowly and stepped inside. The small room felt quieter than usual. He removed his jacket and sat heavily in a chair near the window. The city lights outside blurred softly against the glass. Then his eyes drifted once again toward the old wooden box beneath the table. For several minutes, he simply stared at it. Finally, he reached down and opened it carefully. Inside rested old sheet music, competition programs, and faded newspaper clippings from years earlier. One article caught his attention. Young pianist stuns judges with emotional performance. A younger version of Daniel smiled from the photo beside the headline. He barely recognized himself anymore. Back then, his eyes looked hopeful. Alive. Daniel slowly picked up another item from the box. A small silver medal. His father had placed it around his neck after his first major competition victory. A memory surfaced instantly. "You have something special," his father had told him proudly that night. "But promise me something." Young Daniel looked up curiously. "Never play music just to impress people," his father said softly. "Play because it tells the truth." The memory faded. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the medal resting in his hand. Then another memory appeared. A hospital bill sitting on the kitchen table. His younger sister crying quietly in the next room. Rent overdue notices. Missed auditions. Lost opportunities. Dreams slowly disappearing one responsibility at a time. Daniel clenched the medal gently. "I didn't quit because I stopped loving music," he whispered into the empty apartment. "I quit because life gave me no choice." His voice cracked slightly. For years, he convinced himself he made peace with that decision. But tonight, the pain felt fresh again. Suddenly, a knock sounded at the door. Daniel quickly wiped his eyes and stood up. When he opened the door, he looked surprised. The academy director stood outside holding a small paper bag. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said calmly. Daniel looked confused. "Sir, how did you find my address?" "One of the staff members helped," the director admitted with a faint smile. "May I come in?" A few moments later, they sat across from each other inside the small apartment while rain tapped softly against the windows. The director glanced around the room. His eyes quickly noticed the old keyboard piano and music sheets on the table. "You never really stopped," he said quietly. Daniel looked away. The director placed the paper bag on the table. Inside were sandwiches and coffee from a nearby cafe. "I remember being your age," he continued. "I thought talent alone guaranteed success." Daniel stayed silent. "But life interrupts people sometimes," the director said softly. "Family, loss, survival." Daniel finally looked up. For the first time, someone seemed to truly understand him. "You found the articles," Daniel guessed. The director nodded slowly. "You were exceptional. That was another lifetime." "No," the director replied gently. "That was the real you." Daniel let out a tired breath. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "People in that academy spent years training for this opportunity. They belong on that stage. And you don't." Daniel hesitated. Then he finally admitted the truth he avoided for years. "I'm afraid." The room fell silent except for the rain outside. The director leaned forward slightly. Afraid of failing? Daniel shook his head slowly. Afraid that music still means everything to me. The director's expression softened. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the director stood up calmly and walked toward the apartment door. Before leaving, he turned back one final time. The performance is in 2 days, he said quietly. If you choose to walk away, nobody will force you. He paused briefly. But some opportunities return only once. After the door closed, Daniel remained sitting alone in silence. His eyes slowly moved toward the keyboard piano again, then toward the old silver medal resting beside him. Outside, thunder rolled across the city sky, and deep inside himself, something long buried had finally begun waking up again. The next morning, dark clouds covered the city sky as Daniel Reed stood quietly outside the music academy, holding a cup of cheap coffee in his hands. Cars moved slowly through the wet streets while students rushed toward the entrance carrying instruments and music folders. Daniel barely slept the night before. The academy director's words kept repeating in his head over and over. Some opportunities return only once. Even now, standing outside the building, Daniel still didn't know what decision to make. Part of him wanted to walk away forever. Life had already taught him how dangerous hope could become. But another part of him, the part he buried for years, couldn't stop thinking about the piano. He slowly entered through the side door like always. The familiar smell of polished wood and old music sheets filled the hallways. Students moved around quickly preparing for final rehearsals before the famous director's arrival the next evening. But the moment people noticed Daniel, conversations immediately changed. Whispers followed him everywhere. That's him. The janitor. The one replacing a real pianist. Daniel kept his head down and continued walking toward the storage room. Inside, he quietly placed his cleaning supplies against the wall and sat down for a moment. His chest felt tight from the pressure building around him. He had spent years avoiding attention. Now it surrounded him constantly. A few minutes later, someone knocked lightly on the open storage room door. Daniel looked up. It was the academy director. You came, the director said calmly. Daniel gave a tired smile. I still work here. The director stepped inside. I'm not asking about your job. Silence filled the room briefly. Then Daniel finally asked the question weighing heavily on him. Why are you doing this? The director folded his arms thoughtfully. Because I've spent 30 years teaching music, he answered. And I know the difference between someone who plays notes and someone who tells a story. Daniel looked away quietly. You heard only a few minutes of music. That was enough. Daniel sighed softly. You don't understand how long it's been. Then remind yourself. Those words stayed in Daniel's mind long after the director walked away. Later that afternoon, the academy held closed rehearsals for the final performers. Teachers sat scattered through the theater making notes while students practiced under pressure. Daniel stood alone backstage staring at the large curtain. His name now appeared officially on the performance list taped near the wall. Seeing it made his stomach twist with anxiety. One of the stage assistants approached nervously. Mr. Reed? She asked carefully. Daniel looked surprised. Nobody had called him that in years. You're scheduled for piano rehearsal in 10 minutes. Daniel's heartbeat quickened instantly. The rehearsal. This would be the first time he touched a real stage piano in front of people after many years. He started quietly, but before he could finish, another voice interrupted nearby. This is unbelievable. The tall student stepped forward with anger written across his face. Two of his friends stood behind him. There are students here who trained since childhood, he said sharply. And now some janitor suddenly gets a chance because of one little melody? Daniel stayed calm. I didn't ask for this. But you accepted it. Daniel hesitated. The student shook his head in frustration. You know what the worst part is? He continued. People are starting to talk about you more than the actual performers. His voice carried jealousy more than anger now. Daniel understood that feeling. For these students, music wasn't just art. It was their future, their identity. And suddenly an outsider threatened the attention they worked for. I'm not your enemy, Daniel said quietly. The student laughed bitterly. Then prove it. Walk away. Daniel lowered his eyes without answering. The student scoffed and walked off toward the stage. But deep inside, his words hit harder than Daniel wanted to admit. Maybe he really didn't belong there anymore. Maybe this entire situation was a mistake. A few minutes later, Daniel slowly walked onto the rehearsal stage. Bright overhead lights blinded him for a second. The theater looked enormous from the piano bench. Teachers whispered quietly while a few students watched from the back rows with crossed arms. Daniel's hands immediately became cold. He sat down carefully before the grand piano. The black polished surface reflected the stage lights like glass. For several seconds, he simply stared at the keys. Memories flooded back instantly. Competitions. Recitals. His father smiling proudly from the audience. Then came darker memories. Funerals. Bills. Years of silence. Daniel swallowed hard. A teacher near the stage finally spoke. You may begin whenever ready. Daniel slowly lifted his trembling hands toward the keys. But just as he adjusted himself on the piano bench, crack, the bench shifted suddenly beneath him. One side dropped unevenly. Several students burst into laughter immediately. Daniel grabbed the piano to steady himself before falling completely. The sound echoed embarrassingly through the theater. The tall student looked away quickly, hiding a smirk. A stage assistant rushed forward nervously. Oh no! I'm so sorry. Daniel stood up quietly while heat rushed into his face. Humiliation spread through the room. Some students whispered behind their hands while others openly smiled. One teacher looked furious. Who set this bench? He demanded sharply. Nobody answered. Daniel immediately understood something felt wrong. The bench hadn't broken naturally, but instead of accusing anyone, he simply stepped back from the piano. It's fine, he said quietly. The laughter slowly faded, but the damage remained. Daniel could feel everyone staring at him again, waiting, judging, expecting him to fail. For one painful moment, he considered walking off the stage forever. His chest tightened with old fear. This was exactly why he buried music years ago. Not because he stopped loving it, because the dream hurt too much. Then suddenly, another memory appeared in his mind. His father sitting beside him years ago after a failed competition performance. You know what real musicians do? His father asked gently. Young Daniel shook his head sadly. They keep playing. The memory hit him deeply. Slowly, Daniel sat back down at the piano. The theater became quieter. Even the students stopped whispering. Daniel adjusted the damaged bench carefully and closed his eyes for one brief second. Then his fingers touched the keys. The first note filled the theater softly. Warm, deep, honest. Instantly, the entire room changed. The laughter disappeared completely. Daniel continued playing. The melody carried emotion so naturally that it no longer sounded like performance practice. It sounded like real life pouring out through music. Pain, hope, loss, love. Every note felt human. Teachers slowly lifted their heads in surprise. Students stopped moving entirely. Even the stage crew near the curtain stood frozen. Daniel forgot about the audience after a while. Forgot about judgment. Forgot about fear. For the first time in years, he simply played from the heart. The music grew stronger, more emotional. Some parts soft enough to feel like whispers. Others powerful enough to shake the room. The academy director stood near the back entrance watching silently. He noticed something important immediately. Daniel wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was telling his story. By the time the final note faded into silence, nobody moved for several seconds. The entire theater stayed completely still. Then one teacher quietly whispered, "Incredible!" Another slowly shook his head in disbelief. The tall student near the aisle looked stunned. Not angry anymore, just shocked. Because deep down, even he understood the truth now. Daniel wasn't pretending. He was genuinely gifted. Daniel slowly opened his eyes and looked around the silent theater. Suddenly he seemed embarrassed again, almost like he forgot people were listening. "I'm sorry," he said quietly while standing from the piano bench. I got carried away. Nobody laughed this time. The academy director stepped onto the stage slowly. You have nothing to apologize for, he said. Daniel looked uncomfortable under everyone's attention again. The director turned toward the teachers seated nearby. I believe rehearsal is finished. One by one, people slowly began standing from their seats. But conversations sounded completely different now. Nobody mocked Daniel anymore. Now they whispered with disbelief. Where has he been all these years? That performance felt real. I've never heard emotion like that before. The tall student remained silent near the aisle while watching Daniel walk backstage. For the first time since meeting him, jealousy mixed with something unexpected. Respect. Later that evening, Daniel sat alone backstage after everyone left. The theater lights had dimmed while rain softly tapped against the roof overhead. He stared quietly at the grand piano from across the stage. Something inside him felt different now. Not healed, not fully confident, but alive again. For years, music had existed only as painful memories trapped inside him. Tonight, for the first time in a very long while, felt possible again. The morning of the final performance arrived with heavy rain pouring across the city streets. Gray clouds covered the sky while people hurried beneath umbrellas and glowing streetlights. Inside the academy, however, nobody cared about the weather. Today was the day everything would change for someone. The famous music director was arriving that evening. Students filled every hallway long before sunrise. Some practiced scales nervously in empty classrooms while others sat alone reviewing sheet music again and again. Teachers moved quickly through the building carrying schedules and performance lists. The pressure inside the academy felt almost unbearable. And somehow Daniel Reed stood in the middle of it all. As he entered through the side hallway carrying his old jacket, several students looked toward him immediately. But the atmosphere had changed after yesterday's rehearsal. The mocking laughter was gone. Now people watched him differently, curiously, carefully, even respectfully. Daniel still felt uncomfortable with the attention. He quietly placed his cleaning supplies in the storage room before heading toward the theater stage for final preparations. Near the hallway entrance, the tall student stood alone beside a practice room door. The moment he saw Daniel approaching, his expression tightened slightly. For a second, it looked like he wanted to say something, but instead he simply stepped aside silently. Daniel nodded politely as he passed. No insults, no jokes. That silence alone felt strange. Inside the theater, workers adjusted stage lights while technicians tested microphones. The grand piano stood in the center beneath a warm spotlight, waiting for the evening performance. The academy director reviewed schedules near the front row. When he noticed Daniel, a calm smile crossed his face. How are you feeling? He asked. Daniel let out a quiet breath. Honestly, the director nodded. Terrified, the director chuckled softly. That means you still care. Daniel looked toward the piano. I haven't performed in front of people for years. And yet yesterday you made an entire room forget how to breathe. Daniel smiled faintly but didn't answer. Deep down, fear still sat heavily inside him. Yesterday's rehearsal had gone well, but tonight would be different. Tonight the theater would be full. Important guests, professional musicians, critics, and the famous director himself. People with power, people with expectations, people who could change lives with one decision. Daniel wondered if he truly belonged among them. Later that afternoon, final rehearsals began. One by one, students performed short sections while teachers gave last-minute advice. Daniel waited quietly backstage listening to the music echo through the curtains. Some performers played perfectly. Fast fingers, sharp technique, precise timing. But something still felt missing. Even Daniel noticed it. The performances sounded impressive, but not personal. While waiting, Daniel sat alone near the backstage wall holding a small folded photograph in his hands. The same old picture of himself and his father beside a piano years ago. His thumb brushed gently across the faded image. I wish you could see this, he whispered quietly. Suddenly, Footsteps approached nearby. Daniel quickly placed the photo away. The tall student stood awkwardly a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, the student cleared his throat. "About yesterday," he began quietly. Daniel looked up calmly. The student struggled finding the right words. "The piano bench," he admitted. "That was my fault." Daniel stayed silent. "I loosened it before rehearsal." The student continued with guilt in his voice. "I thought if you embarrassed yourself, the director would replace you." Daniel looked at him for several seconds. The student lowered his eyes. "I know it was wrong." Daniel could see genuine shame on his face now. "What's your name?" Daniel asked softly. The student looked surprised by the question. "Adrian." Daniel nodded slowly. "Adrian. When I was younger, I used to think talent was a competition too. / Adrian looked confused. "But music isn't about defeating someone else," Daniel continued quietly. "It's about saying something real." Adrian remained silent. Then he finally admitted the truth. "I was angry because everyone suddenly started talking about you instead of us." Daniel understood completely. "You worked hard for this." "So did you," Adrian said honestly. The two stood quietly for a moment before Adrian spoke again. "For what it's worth, I hope you do well tonight." Daniel gave a small grateful smile. "Thank you." As Adrian walked away, Daniel felt something inside him soften. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he no longer felt completely alone there. Evening finally arrived. Luxury cars lined the academy entrance while photographers and important guests entered beneath glowing lights. The building looked more elegant than ever. Inside the theater, every seat quickly filled with teachers, donors, musicians, and invited guests from across the city. Excitement buzzed through the crowd. Then suddenly, whispers spread near the entrance. "He's here." The famous music director had arrived. An older man with silver hair and sharp eyes walked calmly through the theater surrounded by academy staff. His reputation in the music world was legendary. Many careers had started because of his decisions. Students backstage grew even more nervous after hearing he arrived. Some paced the floor. Others stretched their fingers repeatedly. Daniel stood quietly near the curtain trying to steady his breathing. His hands felt cold. The academy director approached him one last time before the show began. "Remember something," he said softly. Daniel looked toward him. "You already survived the hardest years of your life," the director continued. "This stage is nothing compared to that." Those words stayed with Daniel as the theater lights slowly dimmed. The performance began. One by one, students walked onto the stage and delivered carefully prepared performances. The audience applauded politely after each piece while judges made notes. Backstage, tension continued building. Then finally, Daniel heard his name announced through the speakers. For a brief second, his heartbeat seemed to stop. "This is it," he whispered to himself. The curtain opened slowly. Bright stage lights flooded his eyes as he stepped forward. Instantly, whispers spread through the audience. "That's him. The janitor? He looks nervous." Daniel could barely hear them over the pounding in his chest. But then he noticed something unexpected. Near the front row, the academy director gave him a small reassuring nod. And beside the aisle, Adrian quietly clapped first before anyone else. Daniel walked toward the piano. Every step felt heavy. The grand piano waited beneath the spotlight like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. He sat down slowly. The audience became silent. Daniel placed his hands above the keys. But suddenly fear hit him harder than ever before. What if they were right? What if he no longer belonged here? What if all those years away from music had destroyed the person he used to be? His fingers trembled slightly. Then another memory returned. His father's voice. "Don't play to impress people. Play the truth." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Then he began. The first note echoed softly through the theater. Immediately, the atmosphere changed. The sound carried warmth and emotion that felt impossible to fake. It wasn't perfect in the polished way some earlier performances had been. It was human. Every note felt connected to real experiences. Struggle, loss, hope, love, years of silence. The audience leaned forward slowly. Daniel forgot about the judges after a while. Forgot about the pressure. Forgot about the crowd. He simply allowed the music to speak for him. The melody grew deeper and more emotional with every passing minute. Soft notes drifted gently through the theater before rising into powerful sections filled with passion and pain. Some audience members looked stunned. Others sat completely motionless. Near the front row, the famous director slowly lowered his pen. He stopped writing notes entirely, because he wasn't just listening anymore. He was feeling the performance. Backstage, students watched silently from behind the curtains. Even those who once mocked Daniel now stared in disbelief. Adrian shook his head slowly. "I've never heard anything like this," he whispered. Inside the theater, emotion spread across the audience quietly. One older woman wiped tears from her eyes while another guest sat frozen with his hands clasped tightly together. Daniel's music reached people in a way technical skill alone never could. Sounded real, and everyone could feel it. As the performance approached its ending, the melody softened gently. One final emotional passage filled the room. Then, silence. Daniel's hands slowly lifted from the keys. The theater remained completely still. No movement, no whispers, just silence hanging in the air. For one terrifying second, Daniel feared he had failed. Then suddenly, the audience erupted. Thunderous applause crashed through the theater. People stood from their seats almost immediately, some cheering, some clapping above their heads, others simply staring in shock. Daniel looked overwhelmed by the reaction. Near the front row, the famous music director rose slowly to his feet. And for the first time all evening, he smiled. The applause inside the theater continued long after Daniel Reed finished playing. People stood from their seats clapping loudly while some audience members shook their heads in disbelief. Daniel remained frozen beside the piano. For years, he had imagined what it might feel like to perform again. But nothing prepared him for this moment. The famous music director slowly walked onto the stage while applause still echoed through the theater. The room gradually became quieter as everyone waited to hear what he would say. Daniel stood nervously near the piano bench, unsure where to even look. Then the director stopped directly in front of him. For a few seconds, he simply stared at Daniel with thoughtful eyes. Finally, he spoke. "How long has it been since your last real performance?" Daniel swallowed quietly. "Almost 15 years. A wave of surprise moved through the audience. The director looked stunned. 15 years? He repeated softly. Daniel nodded. The director glanced toward the grand piano before looking back at him again. "That makes tonight even more remarkable." The audience applauded once more. Daniel felt overwhelmed by the attention. The director motioned toward 2 chairs placed near the stage and invited Daniel to sit beside him. Cameras from local media crews quickly turned toward them while students watched silently from backstage. "This young man," the director announced to the audience, "just reminded everyone in this room why music exists in the first place." The theater became completely silent. "We heard many technically excellent performances tonight," the director continued. "But technical skill alone cannot move the human heart." He looked directly at Daniel. "Truth can." Daniel lowered his eyes quietly, clearly emotional. The director leaned back slightly in his chair. "I have judged musicians for over 30 years, he said, "and I can usually tell within seconds whether someone is simply performing or truly saying something meaningful." Then he smiled faintly. "Tonight, you told an entire life story through music." The audience applauded again. Backstage, students stood silently listening. Even teachers looked emotional. Daniel tried speaking, but emotion tightened his throat. I don't know what to say," he admitted quietly. The director's expression softened. "Then tell us something simple," he replied. "Why did you stop playing?" The question changed the atmosphere immediately. The audience became still again. Daniel stared down at his hands for several seconds before answering. "My father passed away when I was younger," he said softly. "After that, everything changed very fast. His voice remained calm, but pain still hid beneath it. We struggled financially, he continued. My younger sister depended on me, so music became impossible. The room listened carefully. I thought leaving music would become easier over time, Daniel admitted. But it never really did. Several people in the audience nodded quietly, because suddenly, Daniel no longer looked like just a performer. He looked human, real. The director sat silently for a moment before asking another question. So why return now? Daniel glanced toward the piano. Then he smiled faintly. I'm honestly not sure, he answered. Maybe because music never fully left me. A soft murmur moved through the audience. The Academy director stood near the side stage watching proudly. At that moment, he knew something important had happened inside the Academy. Not just a performance. A reminder that talent can exist anywhere, and that life sometimes hides extraordinary people behind ordinary jobs. After the event ended, crowds filled the theater lobby discussing Daniel's performance. Guests who had ignored him earlier now wanted to shake his hand. Teachers congratulated him warmly while students stared with admiration. Daniel looked overwhelmed by all of it. Near the hallway entrance, Adrian approached quietly. For a second, he looked nervous again. Then he finally spoke. You were incredible tonight. Daniel smiled modestly. Thank you. Adrian hesitated before continuing. I owe you another apology. Daniel shook his head gently. You already apologized. No, Adrian said honestly. I mean for judging you before even knowing you. Daniel studied him quietly. Adrian looked embarrassed. I kept thinking music was about being better than everyone else, he admitted. But when you played tonight, it felt different. Daniel nodded slowly. That's because music isn't really about competition. Adrian smiled faintly. I understand that now. The two shook hands before Adrian walked away. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, Daniel felt accepted there. Not as the janitor, not as the outsider, but as a musician. Later that night, after most guests left, the famous director asked Daniel to join him privately inside the empty theater. The large room looked peaceful now. Only a few dim lights remained on above the stage. Daniel sat quietly near the front row while the director reviewed several papers. Finally, the older man looked up. I would like to offer you something, he said. Daniel's chest tightened immediately. The director placed a business card on the table between them. There's an international performance program beginning later this year, he explained. We invite musicians from different backgrounds to perform across several countries. Daniel listened carefully. I believe you belong there. Daniel stared at the card silently. Felt unreal. After all these years, an opportunity again. But I'm not young anymore, he admitted quietly. The director smiled slightly. Emotion doesn't age. Daniel looked down, struggling to process everything happening so quickly. The director continued. You have something many trained performers spend their whole lives searching for. Daniel looked up. A reason behind every note. Silence filled the theater for a moment. Then Daniel finally asked the question still sitting heavily inside him. What if I fail? The director leaned back calmly. You already survived losing your dream once, he answered. That means failure no longer has the power to destroy you. Those words hit Daniel deeply. For years, fear controlled him. Fear of disappointment. Fear of loss. Fear of starting over. But maybe the director was right. Maybe he had already survived the hardest part long ago. By the time Daniel left the academy that night, the rain had finally stopped. Cold wind moved gently through the empty streets while city lights reflected across wet sidewalks. Daniel walked home slowly, holding the business card carefully inside his coat pocket. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked empty. The next morning, everything changed. Videos from the performance spread rapidly online overnight. Audience members had uploaded clips of Daniel playing, and people everywhere became fascinated by the story of the quiet janitor who stunned an entire music academy. News stations requested interviews. Social media pages shared his performance. Comments flooded everywhere. Real talent. So emotional. This brought tears to my eyes. Inside the academy, students gathered around phones watching clips repeatedly. Daniel arrived through the side entrance like always, but this time something felt completely different. People smiled at him. Some even applauded softly when he walked through the hallway. Daniel looked almost embarrassed by the attention. One teacher approached him warmly. "You inspired a lot of people last night." Daniel smiled modestly. "I only played music." The teacher shook her head gently. "No," she said softly. "You reminded people not to give up on themselves." That sentence stayed with Daniel the rest of the day, because deep inside he realized something important. For years he thought his dream had died. But dreams don't always disappear completely. Sometimes they simply wait quietly for the right moment to return. A few weeks later, the Academy organized a special concert featuring Daniel as the headline performer. Tickets sold out faster than anyone expected. People traveled from different cities just to hear him play again. Backstage before the concert began, Daniel stood alone beside the piano wearing a simple black suit. The same nervous feeling still existed inside him. But now it felt different. Not fear. Purpose. The Academy director approached quietly beside him. "Big night," he said with a smile. Daniel nodded. "I still can't believe any of this is real." The director looked toward the crowded theater. "It's real because you earned it." The audience outside grew louder with excitement. Daniel took one deep breath. Then his eyes drifted toward the old piano room visible down the hallway. The same room where everything started again. The same room where people once laughed at him. And the same room where he first remembered who he truly was. Daniel smiled softly to himself. Then he walked toward the stage. Not as a janitor hiding from his past. Not as a forgotten dream. But as the musician he was always meant to become.